Look at that line. Now up to 6.07%. It's actually climbed a little bit potentially since then. And that is the highest that we've seen since 2008. And
kind of debt, if you like, has been accumulated by pension funds. So having a real problem in the government bond market has the potential to spill over into insurance company problems or bank problems. While I don't want to be kind of alarmist about this, there is the risk of contagion.
Tax cutter.
I'm going to interrupt because he's out. He's been sacked. So Kwasi Kwarteng, he's gone.
But here he is. Kwasi Kwarteng, should Liz Truss resign? Should Liz Truss resign, Mr. Kwarteng?
I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
All these major events and many more in the past happened because of the bond market, not because people on the street revolted. Imagine how powerful the bond market must be if it can force the Prime Minister of one of the most powerful and influential countries in the world to resign. A country with nuclear weapons, one of the only 9 countries in the world to have them, and a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, one of the only 5 in the world. James Carville, Bill Clinton's economic advisor, once said, "I used to think that if there was reincarnation, I wanted to come back as the president or the pope or a .4 baseball hitter. But now I want to come back as the bond market. You can intimidate everybody." He said this because he was worried how the bond market might react to Bill Clinton's economic stimulus. That is his plan to borrow and spend to boost the economy. The bond market is so powerful that it intimidates even the American and Chinese presidents, arguably the most powerful individuals in the world. What or who is this bond market that scares and controls even the most powerful people in the world?
You can't run from them, you can't cheat them, you can't sway them with excuses. If you owe them money and you don't want to crumble yourself, you pay it back.
The bond market is the modern day version of the Iron Bank, but it operates just as it was described. It's faceless, we all live in its shadow, and even the governments crumble if they go against it. It's faceless because no individual controls it. It's a collection of investors of various kinds spread all over the world, from American banks and European pension schemes to Arab sovereign wealth funds and Asian exporters like China, Japan, Taiwan, and Singapore. We all live in its shadow, but we don't know it. British people have had a crash course in how the interest rates bond market charges directly affects everything from the cost of their mortgage to the safety of their pension funds. Your mortgage payments and EMIs increase because the bond market decided to charge a higher rate of interest. You always pay back if you don't want to crumble. Bond markets don't exactly finance your enemies if you don't pay them back, but they will make it harder to borrow, and that is very harmful for a nation.
The basic principle is, I lend you money, and after an agreed upon period of time, you return it with interest.
And what if I don't?
Well, you have to.
But what if I don't?
This is why I don't lend you money.
In any given year, if the government revenues from taxes and government spending are equal, the government would have a balanced budget and it wouldn't need to borrow money from the bond market. If the revenues are greater than spending, the result is a budget surplus, using which government can even pay back old debt. Governments need to borrow only if the government's spending is greater than the revenue it brings in to cover its expenses. Governments also borrow from bond markets to fund big construction projects sometimes. I'm obviously simplifying. Government budgets are almost always in deficit because it's too tempting for politicians to spend money and win the support of voters. The United States, for instance, has run a deficit in 77 of the past 90 years under governments run by both parties. During tough times like COVID-19 pandemic, government spending must increase. At the same time, tax revenues tend to decrease too. People are working less and therefore paying less in taxes. If you cannot convince the bond markets, you do. Liz Truss knows this very well.
And how much wheat and barley and beef and pork do you produce on Dragonstone to feed your 4,000 men on your 32 ships?
None.
You can see why these numbers seem unlikely to add up to a happy ending. From our perspective, I'm afraid we must respectfully decline your request.
In the modern day, the fate of government that failed to earn the confidence of bond markets is equally bad. Liz Truss is a case in point. UK has a big GDP growth problem. The economy was growing very slow. To increase growth, Liz Truss' government announced a package of tax cuts and energy price cap on September 23rd in what was called a mini budget. The tax cuts were supposed to encourage more investment, resulting in more economic growth. The initial loss of government revenue due to tax cuts would be recovered when tax is collected from a bigger economy in a few years. At least that's the theory of supply-side economics.
I want to pay tribute to my predecessor, Liz Truss. She was not wrong to want to improve growth in this country. It is a noble aim. And I admired her restlessness to create change. But some mistakes were made.
The problem was that most of the tax cuts and emergency spending were signaled, but the much-needed economic reforms needed to bring about economic growth and pay for the tax cuts were vague. The government spending cuts needed to balance the books in the short term were unspecified. And finally, government's plan was not scrutinized by the Office for Budget Responsibility, a watchdog, as is normally the case. So the bond market had no reason to believe that tax cuts would bring about economic growth. Without independent forecasts or detailed supply-side reform plans, markets were to a certain extent asked to have faith that the 3-week-old government they knew nothing about could deliver the growth necessary to close the fiscal gap. Markets cannot price plans they have not seen. Liz Truss failed to win the confidence of the bond markets. As a result, the British pound collapsed and interest rates on government bonds increased, further aggravating the burden of inflation in UK. She was eventually forced to resign. The bond markets don't care if it's the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom or the President of America. It is not impressed by pomp, pageantry, myths, or legends. It does not care about emotions and feelings like pride and nationalism. All it cares about is hard numbers, like the representative of the Iron Bank explains here.
Across the narrow sea, your books are filled with words like usurper and madman and blood right. Here, our books are filled with numbers. We prefer the stories they tell. More plain, less open to interpretation.
I think defaulting on the national debt should be regarded as unthinkable.
Every few years, it ends up precariously close to a partial default, only to yield right before taking the country's full faith and credit and global markets over the precipice. The precipitating events are never economic, but always political. Since 1917, Congress has in one form or another retained a limit on the amount of debt the Treasury can issue. Because Congress tends to run budget deficits, this has needed raising or suspension more than 100 times since its inception. In contemporary America, the nearing of a binding debt ceiling is perversely seen as a moment of maximal leverage. The Treasury calls the day that it no longer has the ability to pay for both its debt service and essential promises like Social Security, the X date. Wall Street types call it the drop dead date. When that day comes, overnight government would have to do spending cuts of as much as 40% with catastrophic consequences.
Nearly 50 million seniors could stop receiving Social Security payments or see them delayed. Our troops would not know when they would get their next paycheck. We have 30 million families who rely on the monthly child tax credit, and they would not receive that relief, at least on time.
Not just that, the yields on American debt would spike, the dollar would plunge in value, equities would fall by a third, and a recession would ensue. Domestic savers and investors, anticipating a fall in the value of the local currency, will scramble to withdraw their money from bank accounts and move it out of the country. To avoid bank runs and steep currency depreciation, the government may shut down banks and impose capital controls. As punishment for default, capital markets will either impose a punitive borrowing rates or refuse to lend at all. And credit rating agencies will no doubt warn against investing in the country. Just the possibility of a default without an actual default has very bad consequences. In 2001, Republicans brought the country close to the brink of default in order to force budget cuts. resulting in a downgrade to the country's credit rating for the first time. Borrowing costs for the federal government rose by 1.3 billion in that year alone.
Welcome to the Iron Bank. Please, sit. Few Lord Stannis.
This is Stannis of the House Baratheon, King of the Andals and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm.
These bond markets do not care who you are. They're not impressed by the pomp and pageantry of the head of the state. They don't care about myths and legends, and it's not their job to be patriotic. It is easy to hate them, but they exist for a reason. Without someone to answer to and someone to hold their feet to fire, the Lannisters would go on indulging in expensive wars that would benefit no one but themselves. In the modern day, a world in which the limits of the acceptable fiscal deficit are clearly defined by the markets, force politicians on either side of the political divide to be more candid in their choices on the level of public spending and taxation required to fund. If the Democrats in America want better public services and the Republicans lower taxes, they will need to confront the trade-offs. If you like such macroeconomic videos, I recommend you watch this video on the Indian economy where I analyze its trends. I'm Sharat Mantravadi. Thanks for watching.